I kind of like Diddy.
You guys don't need to worry about me getting revenge from Diddy. I've got 3 moves that make sure he'll never be able to come after me or my family. First, I personally reached out to the victims' legal teams. The real reason he's not getting out is those buried cases behind the scenes. I provided legal funding for 7 victims who had been silent for years and brought in the top criminal attorneys in the country. Second, I bought up every potential post-release business deal he had lined up. I planned this 2 years in advance, so by the time he got sentenced and still had hope of getting out, every partner had already cut ties with him. Third, I don't just have evidence, I've got backups. This is an entire minefield that's been buried for 20 years. I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years. With testimonies from the victims, we interviewed over a dozen people he tricked, threatened, or violated. You think that's harsh? No, he destroyed other people's lives for decades. I'm just making sure he spends a few extra years in prison for it. I'm not afraid of his people, not afraid of his threats. I know he's still in there fantasizing about a comeback, but the truth is, he's never coming back.
People say trolling is random, that it's impulsive, that it doesn't mean anything. But that idea only works if you ignore one simple truth. Random behavior doesn't repeat itself with precision. Random behavior doesn't show up at the same moments. And random behavior doesn't circle the same person again and again and again. That's when trolling stops being comedy and starts becoming communication. 50 Cent has been called a troll for years, but anyone who's actually watched him closely knows something feels different about the way he trolls certain people. It's not loud, it's not desperate, it's controlled. And control is never accidental. This story isn't about jokes, it's about patterns hiding inside jokes. Because jokes are the safest place to hide something serious. People laugh first, they question later. And by the time they start questioning, the message has already spread. That's how humor works when it's used intentionally. 50 Cent doesn't troll everyone the same way. That's the first thing people miss. He jokes about a lot of people, sure, but only a few names keep coming back into the picture. Only a few situations get revisited over time. And when you isolate those moments, one thing becomes clear. This isn't chaos, it's selection. Selection requires thought, and thought requires purpose. Every time 50 Cent trolls Diddy, the internet laughs it off. They call it entertainment. They call it clout. They call it just 50 being 50. But jokes that feel harmless don't stay alive for years. They don't resurface at specific moments. And they don't make people uncomfortable on a second watch. These do. Because the humor always lands when tension already exists. When conversations are quiet, when people aren't sure what to say, that's not coincidence, that's timing. And timing tells you everything about intent. 50 Cent doesn't rush. He waits. He lets moments breathe. He lets silence build. And then he drops something small enough to look harmless, but sharp enough to be noticed. That's not how someone behaves when they're joking for attention. That's how someone behaves when they're delivering a message without wanting credit for it. Before going to deeper of this video, make sure to like this video, subscribe our channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss any new video like this. Now let's get back, because once you understand that trolling can be intentional, the entire dynamic changes. You stop asking, why is he joking? And you start asking, why now? Why this moment? Why this name? Why this tone? Those questions don't have easy answers. And that's exactly the point. If 50 Cent wanted clarity, he would give it. If he wanted confrontation, he would escalate. If he wanted attention, he would go further. But he doesn't. He stays right in the middle. Just enough humor to stay safe. Just enough specificity to be understood. And just enough silence afterward to let the internet do the rest. That balance is not something you stumble into. It's something you practice. That's why his trolls don't fade away like normal jokes. They linger. They resurface. They age differently. People revisit them months later, years later. And suddenly they don't feel as funny anymore. They feel pointed. And when humor starts to feel pointed, it's no longer just humor. It's a signal. This video isn't about proving what those signals mean. It's about recognizing that they exist. Because once you accept that trolling can be a delivery system, you start seeing the method behind the madness. And that's where this story really begins. To understand why this kind of trolling matters, you have to understand who 50 Cent actually is when the cameras aren't rolling for laughs. He didn't come up in a world where words were cheap. He came up where words had consequences. That mindset never leaves you. People assume success softens you, but for people like him, it sharpens instincts instead. 50 Cent doesn't speak unless there's a reason. And when he does, he rarely says exactly what people expect. That's because he understands something most celebrities never learn. In both the streets and the industry, direct confrontation is rarely the smartest move. Indirect pressure lasts longer, it travels further, and it keeps you protected. That's the space he operates in. When he jokes, it's not careless, it's layered. There's surface-level humor for the crowd, and there's subtext for anyone paying attention. That's why his trolling never feels emotional. There's no anger in it, no panic, no rush. It's calm. And calm behavior around powerful people usually comes from experience, not arrogance. He's seen how the industry works behind closed doors, how narratives get shaped, how silence protects certain figures, how speaking too directly can end careers quietly. So he adapted. Instead of interviews, he uses timing. Instead of statements, he uses reactions. Instead of explanations, he uses humor. Because humor gives you cover. If challenged, it's a joke. If ignored, it still lands. If shared, it spreads faster than truth ever could. That's not accidental. That's strategy. Another thing people misunderstand is that 50 Cent doesn't troll from the outside. He trolls from knowledge. He knows who gets uncomfortable when their name trends. He knows when silence feels heavy. He knows when the internet is already watching. That's when he moves. Not before, not after. Right in the middle. That precision is what separates random trolling from intentional messaging. He also understands power dynamics. Power doesn't like being questioned directly, but it hates being laughed at quietly. Because laughter removes control without confrontation. You can argue with accusations, you can deny claims, but you can't easily shut down a joke without amplifying it. And amplification is the last thing powerful people want. That's why his approach works. He never forces a response. He never demands attention. He never pushes hard enough to trigger defense. He lets discomfort do the work. That's also why he doesn't troll everyone the same way. With most people, it's quick, disposable, forgotten. With Diddy, it's different. It's restrained, repeated, and always timed around moments when tension already exists. That tells you this isn't about entertainment. It's about placement. Placement of ideas. Placement of reminders. Placement of pressure without fingerprints. People who think this is just clout chasing miss the point entirely. Clout chasing is loud. It escalates. It begs for reaction. This does the opposite. It waits, it watches, and then it nudges, just enough. Because when you understand the system, you don't need to break it. You just need to show people where it bends. And that's exactly what 50 Cent has been doing for years. Not by shouting truths, but by laughing at moments that aren't supposed to be funny. And once you recognize that mindset, every single troll starts to feel less like comedy and more like a calculated move in a much longer game. To really see what's going on, you have to separate two things people usually mix together: random trolling and targeted trolling. Random trolling is messy. It jumps from name to name. It reacts emotionally. It burns out fast. Targeted trolling is the opposite. It's quiet, selective, and repetitive in a very specific way. This is where Diddy becomes impossible to ignore. Because if you line up 50 Cent's behavior over the years, one thing stands out clearly. He does not treat everyone the same. There are plenty of celebrities he's joked about once or twice and then moved on from. Those jokes disappear. They don't come back. They don't age. They don't carry weight. But with Diddy, the behavior loops. Same tone, same calm delivery, same sense that the joke is landing on something deeper than surface-level humor. And that difference matters, because repetition is not an accident. When the same person becomes the target across different years, different headlines, different moments, it stops being coincidence. It becomes choice, and choice reveals intent. What makes this even more interesting is how little effort he puts into it. There's no long rant, no breakdown, no attempt to convince anyone of anything. Just short, perfectly placed moments. That restraint is important. Someone joking for attention would push harder. They'd escalate. They chase reactions. 50 Cent never does. He drops something, then disappears. That's not how random trolls behave. That's how someone behaves when they already know the message will travel on its own. Another key difference is tone. Random trolling usually comes with exaggeration, anger, overperformance. These moments don't. They're dry, almost casual. Sometimes they barely even feel like jokes at first. That's why people often don't react immediately. They laugh and then pause. That pause is where the message lives. Because humor that hits too close creates confusion. And confusion makes people rewatch, reread, reconsider. That's high replay value, and it's not accidental. Targeted trolling also follows tension. It doesn't show up when everything is calm. It shows up when conversations are already uncomfortable, when people don't know what to say, when silence starts to feel noticeable. That's when these moments appear. Not to explain anything, just to underline the discomfort. That's how you know this isn't about being funny. It's about pressure. Pressure without confrontation. Pressure without fingerprints. You can dismiss one joke. You can laugh off two. But when the same energy keeps returning to the same person over time, your brain starts looking for meaning whether you want to or not. And that's exactly what's been happening here. Fans notice it. Comment sections notice it. Even people who defend Diddy notice it. They just explain it away differently. Some say it's jealousy. Some say it's rivalry. Some say it's entertainment. But none of those explanations account for the discipline. Because disciplined behavior doesn't come from emotion. It comes from intention. And the biggest giveaway of all, 50 Cent never corrects people. When fans speculate, he doesn't shut it down. When people read into it, he doesn't clarify. When debates explode, he doesn't step in. He lets interpretation run free. That's not something you do if the joke means nothing. That's something you do when the ambiguity is the point. Because ambiguity protects you and activates everyone else. This is the difference between laughing at someone and aiming something at them. And once you see that difference, it becomes impossible to believe these moments are random. They're not chaos. They're signals. Small ones. Safe ones. But repeated enough times that they refuse to disappear. And from here on out, the question isn't whether 50 Cent is trolling. The question is why he keeps choosing the same target, and why he never feels the need to explain himself. Humor is one of the most misunderstood tools in public life. People think it's soft, harmless, just for laughs. But in the right hands, humor is a weapon. Not because it attacks, but because it disarms. When someone jokes, people relax. They stop defending. They stop analyzing too deeply. And that's exactly why humor works better than accusations ever could. An accusation forces a response. A joke invites laughter. And laughter travels faster than truth. 50 Cent understands this better than almost anyone in the industry. He knows that the moment you accuse someone directly, the conversation changes. Lawyers appear. Statements get issued. Sides get chosen. The story dies quickly. But when you joke, the story lives. It spreads. It gets shared. It gets repeated in comment sections, podcasts, group chats. And most importantly, it can't be shut down easily. Because how do you respond to a joke? If you defend yourself, you look sensitive. If you ignore it, the joke feels louder. If you attack back, you give it legitimacy. There's no clean move. That's why humor is such a powerful delivery system. It puts pressure on the other side without ever touching them directly. 50 Cent doesn't use humor to entertain. He uses it to lower the temperature while raising the tension. That sounds contradictory, but it works. People laugh, and then they think. Sometimes not immediately. Sometimes days later. Sometimes years later. That delay matters. Because delayed realization sticks longer. A serious statement gets consumed and forgotten. A joke that ages badly gets remembered. And many of 50 Cent's jokes about Diddy age differently with time. They don't fade. They sharpen. What felt funny in the moment starts to feel pointed later. What felt random starts to feel placed. That's not coincidence. Humor also gives plausible deniability. If anyone questions intent, the answer is simple. It's just a joke. That sentence is a shield. It protects the speaker while leaving the message intact. 50 Cent never explains the joke. That's another key detail. Explaining humor kills it, but it also limits interpretation. By not explaining, he lets the audience decide what it means. And once the audience owns the meaning, it's no longer his responsibility. That's how humor becomes message delivery without ownership. There's another layer to this. Humor changes power dynamics. Power hates being questioned, but it hates being laughed at even more. Because laughter removes fear. It turns authority into something human, something fallible, something that can be mocked. And mocking power, even lightly, is dangerous. Not because it's loud, but because it's contagious. One person laughs, then another, then another. Soon the idea spreads without anyone ever stating it directly. That's why 50 Cent never pushes too far. He doesn't want outrage. He wants circulation. Outrage burns fast. Circulation lasts. A joke that circulates becomes part of culture. It becomes a reference, a callback. And callbacks are powerful because they don't need context. Everyone already remembers. This is why humor masks seriousness so well. People dismiss it on the surface, while absorbing it underneath. They say it's not that deep, but then they keep thinking about it. They replay it. They bring it up again later. That's not an accident. That's design. 50 Cent's humor isn't meant to end conversations. It's meant to start them quietly. And once you understand that, you stop asking whether he's joking. You start asking why his jokes keep landing exactly where tension already exists. Because humor, when used like this, isn't a distraction. It's a delivery method, one that hides in plain sight and stays alive long after the laughter fades. The first time people really noticed it, they didn't know what to do with it. It didn't land like a normal joke. It didn't feel aggressive enough to be a diss. And it definitely didn't feel accidental. It felt placed. That's usually how it starts. One moment that stands out just enough to make people pause. Not explode, not argue. Pause. Fans replay it. Comment sections split. Some laugh it off. Others say, that was weird. And weird is important, because weird moments don't disappear easily. They stick. That first noticeable troll wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't come with a long explanation or a clear punchline. It showed up quietly at a moment when the internet was already tense. That timing mattered, because jokes land differently when people are already uncomfortable. They hit closer. They feel sharper. And instead of pushing the joke further, 50 Cent did something unexpected. He stopped. No follow-up, no clarification, no doubling down. He let the moment exist on its own. That restraint confused people more than escalation ever could. Someone chasing attention would have milked it, posted again, explained the joke, turned it into content. He didn't. He trusted that the moment would travel without him. And it did. People shared it. Screenshots spread, reactions piled up. Not because it was outrageous, but because it felt intentional. That's the difference most people miss. Outrage creates noise. Intent creates curiosity. Curiosity lasts longer. Once that first moment settled in people's memory, something else happened. Every time Diddy's name came up later, people remembered it, not consciously, subconsciously. The joke became a reference point, and when later trolls appeared, they didn't stand alone. They stacked. That's how meaning builds. One isolated joke is nothing, two is coincidence. But when moments stack over time, they start to tell a story without words. And 50 Cent never rushes that process. He doesn't try to explain the story. He lets people notice it forming on their own. That first noticeable troll wasn't meant to expose anything. It was meant to mark a beginning, a signal to anyone paying attention that this wasn't random territory. From that point on, the audience changed. People didn't just laugh anymore. They watched. They waited for timing. They waited for context. And every new moment was judged against the old one. That's when trolling turns into a narrative. And once a narrative exists, every small action carries more weight than it did before. 50 Cent understands this deeply. He knows that the first time you introduce an idea, you don't need to explain it. You just need to place it. After that, the audience does the work. They connect dots. They argue. They revisit. And the most important part, He never takes ownership of the narrative. He doesn't say, "This is what I meant." He doesn't correct interpretations. He doesn't deny implications. He lets meaning float. That's how you keep control without appearing to control anything. Because the moment you explain intent, you limit impact. That first noticeable troll didn't need a punchline. It needed patience. And patience is something random trolls don't have. That's why this moment still matters. Not because of what was said, but because of how it was handled. It wasn't the joke itself that made people uneasy. It was the silence that followed. The silence that told everyone watching that this wasn't a one-off. It was the start of something that would resurface again and again whenever the timing felt right. And from that moment forward, nothing felt accidental anymore. If you look closely, you'll notice something else that separates these moments from normal trolling. Timing, not speed, not frequency. Timing. 50 Cent doesn't jump in the second a headline breaks. He doesn't rush to be first. He doesn't chase attention when emotions are high. He waits. He lets the noise peak. He lets opinions clash. He lets silence start to feel uncomfortable. And then, when people are already unsure how to react, he appears. That delay is intentional, because reacting too fast looks emotional. Reacting too late looks disconnected. But reacting right in the middle? That feels deliberate. That's when a joke lands hardest. When people are already thinking, already uneasy, already paying attention, that's when humor turns into a pressure point. 50 Cent understands that timing shapes meaning more than words ever could. The same joke told at the wrong time disappears. The same joke told at the right time becomes a reference. That's why these moments never feel forced. They feel placed. And once you start watching the timing instead of the content, the pattern becomes obvious. He trolls when conversations stall, when people don't know what to say next, when silence starts to feel louder than statements. That's not when comedians jump in. That's when strategists do. Because silence is fragile. It creates space for interpretation. And interpretation is powerful. By dropping humor into that space, he doesn't fill the silence. He shapes it. He gives people something to hold on to, something to replay, something to argue about. And then he disappears again. No follow-up, no clarification. He leaves the moment behind like a marker. Another thing worth noticing is when he doesn't troll, there are plenty of opportunities where he could say something and doesn't. That restraint is just as telling. Random trolls don't have off switches. They react to everything. Intentional behavior includes silence. Choosing not to speak is just as much a decision as speaking. And 50 Cent chooses his moments carefully. He lets long stretches pass without commentary. He allows people to forget, almost. And then, when the timing is right, he reminds them, not of facts, not of accusations, of presence. That reminder doesn't need detail because memory does the rest. People think timing is about relevance. It's not. It's about emotional readiness. And these moments land when people are ready to receive them, even if they don't realize it yet. That's why the jokes feel heavier on replay, because when you watch them again later, with more context, the timing makes sense. You realize it wasn't random, it was waiting for the right moment to mean something. And meaning is what gives trolling longevity. Anyone can make noise. Few people can place moments. 50 Cent places moments. That's why these jokes don't expire. They don't rely on shock. They rely on timing. And timing turns humor into memory. Memory into pattern. And pattern into something people can't stop noticing once they've seen it. That's when trolling stops being entertainment and starts feeling like a message that only works because it arrives exactly when it's supposed to. What makes all of this even more interesting is what doesn't happen afterward. There's no public response, no back and forth, no escalation, just silence. And silence is not nothing. Silence is a choice. In most online situations, silence looks like weakness, like avoidance, like losing control of the narrative. But when someone has power, silence works differently. Silence becomes strategy. Responding to a joke gives it legitimacy. It pulls it into the spotlight. It turns a moment into a confrontation. And confrontation is exactly what these trolls avoid creating. That's why nothing ever gets addressed directly, because responding would shift the balance. It would turn humor into conflict, and conflict demands resolution. Resolution kills longevity. So instead, the silence stays intact. And that silence does something strange. It amplifies the joke. Because now there's no denial, no clarification, no explanation, just the moment, sitting there, unanswered. That makes people uncomfortable, not angry, uncomfortable. They start asking questions. Why didn't anyone say anything? Why wasn't this shut down? Why was it allowed to exist? And every unanswered question adds weight to the original moment. This is where the power dynamic becomes visible. One side speaks lightly. The other side doesn't speak at all. That imbalance is what gives the trolling its strength. If there was a loud response, the moment would end. If there was a clear denial, people would move on. But silence stretches the moment out over time. It lets it age. And aging is dangerous for jokes. Because jokes don't usually survive context changes. These do. They resurface months later, years later. And each time they come back, they feel different. Not funnier, heavier, because silence never filled the gaps. Another thing people miss is that the silence never looks defensive. There's no panic, no visible stress, just distance. Distance creates mystery, and mystery keeps people watching. That's why fans keep revisiting old posts, why screenshots circulate again, why comment sections light up every time a new moment appears. Not because new information was added, but because nothing was ever resolved. 50 Cent understands this better than most. He doesn't need a response to win the moment. He needs the absence of one. Because absence invites interpretation, and interpretation keeps stories alive. This is why he never pushes harder when there's silence. He doesn't escalate to force a reaction. He lets the silence do the work. He trusts that people will notice the imbalance. One side laughing, the other side saying nothing. That contrast sticks. It creates tension without drama, suspicion without accusation. And tension is what fuels replay value. People don't rewatch because they missed a detail. They rewatch because they are trying to understand the silence. That's the real reaction, not outrage, not defense. Curiosity. And curiosity lasts longer than any argument ever could. So every time there's no response, the moment grows instead of shrinking. It becomes part of a longer story. A story without chapters, without explanations, just moments and gaps. And as long as those gaps remain, the trolling keeps its power. Because silence doesn't erase meaning, it preserves it. Over time, something subtle starts to happen. The jokes stop being consumed as jokes. They turn into references. People don't laugh and move on anymore. They remember, they compare, they connect. Old posts resurface. Screenshots come back into circulation. Moments that once felt isolated start lining up next to each other. And that's when time changes everything. Because time is the one thing humor can't hide from. A joke that means nothing disappears quickly. A joke that carries subtext ages differently. It doesn't fade, it sharpens. What felt harmless years ago suddenly feels intentional. What felt random starts to feel placed. Not because the joke changed, but because context did. This is where replay value is born. People go back to watch old clips again, not to laugh, but to analyze. They reread captions. They look at dates. They notice what was happening around those moments. And suddenly the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Same energy, same restraint, same target, different years. That's when people stop asking, "Is this funny?" and start asking, "Why does this keep happening?" Because repetition over time creates meaning whether you want it to or not. 50 Cent doesn't need to explain anything at this stage. The archive does it for him. Every old moment becomes evidence of consistency, not evidence of guilt or innocence, but evidence of intention. And intention is what separates noise from signal. Another thing time does is remove emotion. When you're watching something live, emotions distort judgment. People react defensively. They pick sides. But when you revisit something years later, emotion fades. All that's left is behavior. And behavior, repeated consistently over time, tells its own story. That's why these moments feel heavier on replay. There's no urgency anymore, no shock, just a calm realization that this wasn't a one-time thing. It was a pattern unfolding slowly. The internet plays a huge role here. It doesn't forget, it archives everything, and archives turn jokes into timelines. Once people start seeing the timeline, the narrative changes. It's no longer about whether a single joke crossed a line. It's about why the same type of joke keeps returning to the same place. That's when humor stops being entertainment and starts becoming documentation. Unintentional documentation, maybe, but documentation nonetheless. And the most powerful part? 50 Cent never reacts to this reinterpretation. He doesn't step in to guide it. He doesn't correct it. He doesn't deny it. He lets time do what it always does. Expose patterns, because once a pattern is visible, it doesn't need commentary. It speaks on its own. This is why these moments refuse to disappear. They're not loud enough to be shut down, not clear enough to be dismissed, and not random enough to be forgotten. They sit in that uncomfortable middle space, waiting. And every time someone new stumbles across the timeline, the cycle starts again. They watch, they laugh, they pause, they rewatch. And slowly they realize the same thing everyone else eventually does. This wasn't chaos, it was consistency. And consistency over time becomes impossible to ignore. That's how jokes turn into signals, not overnight, not all at once, but quietly, through repetition, until the meaning feels heavier than the laughter ever did. At this stage, something shifts from the creator to the audience, because once patterns become visible, people don't wait to be told what they mean. They start interpreting on their own. Comment sections change tone. They stop reacting emotionally and start asking questions. They bring up old moments. They connect timelines. They notice when things line up a little too perfectly. This is where the trolling fully leaves 50 Cent's hands. The internet takes over. Screenshots get reposted, clips get rewatched, captions get analyzed word by word. Not because anyone is looking for drama, but because unresolved patterns demand explanation. And the more people look, the more they realize something important. 50 Cent never tells them what to think. He never says, "This is what I meant." He never says, "Here's the reason." He never confirms or denies interpretations. That silence is intentional, because once the audience starts decoding, the message spreads faster than any explanation ever could. Fans argue with each other. Some defend, some question, some just observe. And all of it keeps the story alive. This is where trolling becomes something else entirely. It becomes participatory. People feel like they're discovering something on their own, and self-discovery sticks harder than being told the answer. That's why these moments don't burn out. They evolve. Every new viewer brings a fresh set of eyes. Every rewatch adds another layer of interpretation. Every comment section becomes a new version of the story, and 50 Cent never interrupts that process. He lets people debate freely. He lets speculation grow. He lets disagreement exist, because disagreement still means engagement, and engagement keeps memory alive. Another thing fans notice is restraint. They notice what he doesn't say. They notice how he never crosses certain lines. They notice how carefully everything is phrased. That restraint adds credibility. It suggests awareness. It suggests calculation. It suggests someone who understands consequences. If this was random trolling, it would be messy, contradictory, careless. But it isn't. It's consistent. And consistency invites analysis. The internet is ruthless with inconsistency. It exposes it immediately. The fact that people keep analyzing these moments years later tells you something important. They sense structure. And once people sense structure, they assume purpose. That's not manipulation. That's human nature. We look for meaning in repetition. So even when people disagree on interpretation, they agree on one thing. This wasn't accidental. And that realization changes how everything is viewed moving forward. New jokes don't start from zero anymore. They arrive with history attached. Every new moment is weighed against the archive. That's powerful, because now even silence feels loud. Every time nothing is said, people notice. Every time no one responds, people remember past moments. The story doesn't need new content to survive. It feeds on memory. And that's when trolling fully transforms into something deeper. Not a punchline, not a distraction, but a signal that keeps echoing long after the joke itself has ended. Because once the audience starts doing the decoding, the message no longer belongs to the speaker. It belongs to everyone watching, and that's when it becomes impossible to fully shut down. By the time you reach this point, the question isn't whether 50 Cent was trolling. That part is obvious. The real question is why it worked, and why it keeps working. Because random jokes don't survive this long. They don't get replayed. They don't get reinterpreted years later. They disappear. These didn't. What survived wasn't the humor. It was the pattern. A pattern of restraint, a pattern of timing, a pattern of choosing silence over explanation. That's what gives these moments their weight. 50 Cent never gives you a conclusion. He never hands you a takeaway. He never tells you what to believe. And that's not a flaw. That's the strategy. Because the moment you explain intent, you reduce impact. The moment you accuse, the story becomes defensive. The moment you clarify, the mystery dies. So instead, he leaves space. Space for people to notice repetition, space for memory to do its work, space for discomfort to grow quietly. That's why these trolls don't feel childish. They feel calculated, not aggressive enough to be shut down, not harmless enough to be ignored. They sit in between, and that middle space is powerful because it forces attention without demanding it. This was never about humiliating anyone. It was never about winning an argument. It was about showing people how something behaves over time, how certain names change energy, how silence becomes louder than words, how laughter can carry meaning without ever taking responsibility for it. That's why the trolls never escalate. They don't need to. Escalation ends stories. Subtlety keeps them alive. And 50 Cent understands longevity better than most. He knows the internet forgets facts, but remembers patterns. He knows outrage burns out, but curiosity lasts. He knows accusations get buried, but jokes get shared. So he chose the one thing that couldn't be easily attacked. Ambiguity. Ambiguity protects the speaker and activates the audience at the same time. And once the audience starts paying attention, the story doesn't need new material. It feeds on memory. That's why even now people still wait. They wait for timing. They wait for silence. They wait for the next moment that feels a little too placed to be random. Not because they expect answers, but because they've learned something more interesting. That sometimes the message isn't in what's said. It's in how often it's said, who it's aimed at, and when it appears. And once you start watching behavior instead of listening to words, the picture becomes much clearer. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't clout. It wasn't accidental. It was a long game, played quietly, safely, and in plain sight. And that's why every time 50 Cent trolled Diddy, there was a reason, even if he never felt the need to explain it.